Lunch was finished. It was midday, and the sun was in the middle of the sky, beating down directly onto the ring. Lady Alice shouted into her horn, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to begin our second round. First, representing the Order of the Wyvern, Roland Rovskar." The crowd cheered and booed as Roland Rovskar came out with his long-handled sword. The horns blared and the drums beat as he walked. "And next, the Lord of Langspeak, Lord Rupert." Young Lord Rupert emerged, and a wyvern trumpeter had decided to give him entrance music. It was a regal-sounding tune, and suited him well. He was clad in his yellow gambeson, wielding his estoc. "Begin!" Roland and Lord Rupert held their weapons out in front of them, and they walked closer to each other. Roland went for a jab, and Lord Rupert slid out of the way. Rupert went for a jab, and it was blocked. Roland jabbed, and jabbed again. Thrust, thrust, jab, jab. He knows to not go for a strike. It will get blocked, just like Tiber's had. Lord Rupert seemed to have noticed as well, so he took a more aggressive approach. The two were hitting their swords together, trying to create an opening, trying to push the other's weapon out of the way so they could attack. Lord Rupert was doing well, but he had forgotten where he was, and Roland's weapon was much longer and forced him back, so he fell out of the ring. "Roland Rovskar is the winner!" Roland walked out of the ring and offered a hand to help Lord Rupert to his feet. There were cheers and boos. Lady Alice shouted, "Next we have Wallace Gibson for the Wyverns versus Lou Boo for the Wyverns as well." "Oh, come on," said the king. "Couldn't they have mixed it up? These matches are never any good. They're part of the same team. They don't fight as hard." And they didn't. Lou Boo ended up the victor after hitting Wallace in the head with his glaive. The next match was Sock the Griffin against the wyvern Vald's son. Like last time, Sock had something to say. "Vald's son? I've heard you've been making threats. You think because you wear black and you shave your face, you think you're threatening? You saw it, and the entire arena saw it, when I dropped that fat son of a bitch right on his head and broke his neck." The king sighed. "For the love of... can't they just fight? I hope Vald knocks him out." Sock continued. "Now when I see you fight, you're just average. Your match? It was average. Me? I'm exceptional. My match was exceptional. Now I know you're a stupid hick, so I'm going to slow down my speech for you. So let me make it very clear for you. I'm going to stick my boot so far up your ass, I'll knock your teeth down your throat. I want you to get the wizard out here right now, because I'm going to beat your ass, you ugly son of a bitch." The crowd cheered and booed. "Now I'm going to show you what a real man can do in the ring, because I'm going to beat you within an inch of your life, and you're going to be begging me for mercy. But I'm just going to say, you're a son of a bitch." And he threw the horn. "Begin!" Vald's son hit Sock with his sword, and the proctor raised his hand. "The winner is..." Sock ran after the proctor and began beating him. He picked up the horn. "I wasn't done fighting, you son of a bitch! Restart the match! Do you hear me, you son of a bitch?" He had the proctor by the throat. "Restart the match!" The proctor threw his hand. Begin?" Vald hit Sock with his sword. And again. And again. Sock swung his warhammer at Vald, but it was knocked out of the way. He is extremely slow with that hammer. Vald was beating Sock with his sword like it was a club, and Sock's skin had broken, and there was blood. But the proctor was scared to call the match. Sock didn't look like he was anywhere close to quitting. He ran up to Vald and grabbed him in a bear hug, and flung him over his head. Vald was ready, so he had straightened himself in the air and landed on his feet. He brought his sword down on Sock's bare, unprotected chest. The proctor didn't stop the match. Sock stood and rushed Vald, picking him up on his shoulder, and ran. He jumped right out of the ring with his opponent on his shoulder, and Vald hit the ground, Sock's shoulder driving into his armored ribs. They were out of the ring, and the proctor raised his hand.
Proctor, who is the winner?
The proctor ran over and grabbed a griffin banner and began waving it.
Sock is the winner!
Sock is a scary guy. Can anybody hurt him? With a sharpened sword, I'm sure they could. What a load of nonsense. They should have disqualified him for throttling the proctor. When Vald hit him while he was down, the match should have been ended. It should have ended the first time, the king complained. Vald's son had to be carried out of the arena.
Up next, we have Sir Frederick Thorncrest of the King's Guard.
Sir Frederick came out to no music and a few cheers.
And his opponent, Z.
Z came out to no music and a few cheers. Now we'll see if this Z's win was just a fluke. Z took a horn to address his opponent. What style do you use? He asked. He handed the horn to Sir Frederick. He paused. Style? I use the bastard sword, though I am trained with polearms, thrusting, and slashing. He gave the horn back to Z. Very well, thank you. I shall begin with that, then. What does he mean, begin with that? Sir Frederick, clad in his mail and plate, took his sword in both hands. Z did the same with his curved sword, and they seemed to mirror each other. Sir Frederick's strike was met with a parry and riposte, which was countered with a parry and riposte, which in turn was met with a parry and riposte, which was dodged. Z was saying something to Sir Frederick and nodding, and Sir Frederick nodded as well. Z took his sword in one hand and began swaying, moving back and forth like he was made of water or horrendously drunk. What kind of stance is that? How could he have any stability without a solid base? Sir Frederick jabbed at him, and Z ducked beneath the blade, falling to the ground, and swiped at his knee. Sir Frederick blocked and went for a lunging jab, and Z knocked his blade skyward. His blade swung over his head, and he brought it back down to block a kick that Z aimed at him. Sir Frederick swung lightning quick at Z, who rolled out of the way, returning to his feet. Sir Frederick launched a frenzy of blows at his opponent. Z was sliding back and forth, moving like wind between each of his opponent's strikes, flowing like water, like a snake writhing. Z walked around him in a circle, saying something, nodding once more. Sir Frederick nodded, and Z took a more proper stance, his sword in front of him, and his lead foot pointed at his opponent, his offhand behind his back. Is this what he meant by style? That's a proper fencing stance. He lunged and began stabbing at Sir Frederick, and their blades sent a song through the arena. Now this is a match. Sir Frederick is making me proud, said the king. But he's losing. Their swords rang loudly as they were blocking, parrying, and trying to land a good strike on each other. Sir Frederick was displaying incredible stamina, fighting in armor the way he was. And as old as he is. Sir Frederick wasn't that old, but he could have been Jacob's grandfather. Jacob thought anyone with gray hair was old enough to be his grandfather, though, even if it was only a few streaks in his beard. Sir Frederick went for a slash, and Z ran up to it, keeping it from following through. Like Lord Rupert did. Is he mixing styles now? Jacob wished he had entered now. Sir Frederick walked around, nodding and saying something. Then he changed his grip on his sword, grabbing it as though it were a fork or a pen. Is he changing styles now too? Jacob was probably the only one to notice. This grip prevented him from using his wrist to swing, but it may have given him more control over the tip. He got in close and began using his elbows to strike, Z blocking with his blade. He was using his elbows as the pivot point for his strikes, and Jacob could now see that his grip allowed him to close the distance. They were both slashing at each other, but instead of parrying with their blades, they were redirecting the strikes with their offhand, shoving their opponent's arm, sending it backwards, to the side, blocking. Sir Frederick grabbed Z's sword with his free hand, and Z began striking, trying to release his grip. He spun around, putting his hand on the pommel of Sir Frederick's sword, and his curved sword was rent from his hand. Sir Frederick's sword was also rent from his own hand. Now Sir Frederick had a curved two-handed sword, and Z had a bastard sword. The crowd cheered. Sir Frederick was running his hand along the blade, saying something to Z. Z was nodding and observing Sir Frederick's sword as well, swinging it around, spinning it. Sir Frederick seemed to ask a question, and Z nodded. Sir Frederick began doffing his armor, and Z stood, watching. Once he had removed his armor and was wearing only his breeches, boots, and a blue vest, he grabbed his curved sword with one hand and began spinning tightly, lightning quick, swinging the sword around at the wrist. Jacob had not remembered Sir Frederick's arms being so big. He said something to Z, and the battle was back on. "Well, that's bizarre, is it not?" asked the king. Jacob shrugged. He had no idea that Sir Frederick knew such a wide variety of styles. He was a tad miffed at the thought that he had been holding back in all of their duels. Z took a strong stance, with a low center of balance close to the ground, grasping with both hands. He began taking strong steps at Sir Frederick, pushing his legs out in front of him, aiming for a kick. Sir Frederick was much faster now, and was dodging and blocking quickly. He began spinning, sending a flurry of blows at Z, who was precisely blocking each strike. Z took on a stance that was more relaxed, and he was standing upright. Sir Frederick launched another assault, and Z was blocking, dodging with very small movements where it looked like the sword might have actually hit him. Then Z took the sword and reversed his grip, so the blade was pointed behind him, and began spinning himself, sending kicks and sword strikes at Sir Frederick. Z's spins were much tighter and faster than Sir Frederick's, who was having a difficult time blocking. A few kicks hit him in the chest, and one landed so hard that it knocked the wind out of him, forcing him to crouch. Z brought his sword right down on Sir Frederick's neck, stopping just short of hitting him, barely tapping him with the edge. The proctor raised his hand.
"The winner is Z!"
The crowd erupted into cheers, and no boos. Z shook Sir Frederick's hand and returned his sword, and Sir Frederick did the same. The knight loaded his pieces of armor into his hauberk and slung it over his shoulder, then walked to the ladies' box. Jacob opened the gate for him. "I apologize for not winning, Your Majesty," he said, bowing. "Rise. You gave us the best match we're likely to see all day, sir. I can only thank you for that. I wish they seeded this tournament better. You should have been in the finals. That match should have been in the finals," said the king, pointing at Sir Frederick. "Thank you, Your Majesty. If you do not mind, I must go grab some water. Then I shall return." "You have my leave," said the king, gesturing with his hand. Jacob grabbed him by the shoulder as he was walking by. "You never told me you knew so many styles, Sir Frederick." "What do you mean?" he asked, confused. "I use them all the time when we're sparring." Now Jacob was confused, so much so that he let Sir Frederick go and said nothing. Edward Guevara hadn't come out to entrance music in the first round, probably because he didn't know it was a thing people did. But he was a prince of the north, and likely a man of abundant wealth. This time a troupe of lute players came out and began strumming vigorously. Then a batch of trumpeteers came and blew their trumpets. The tune was exotic and sweet, and strutting out came the prince, Edward Guevara. He wielded a spear with a long red tassel, and the blade looked like a snake writhing, curving back and forth like a S. He was dark-skinned and wore bright yellow and pink and orange clothing, with some brightly painted armor. He looked like some sort of fruit. Edge was an average-looking man, fair with long blonde hair and beard. He wore the wyvern armor, black scale with the red wyvern, and also wielded a spear, though this spear had a longer haft and shorter blade. Once he came to the ring, Edward Guevara took the horn. "In my home country of Gardenfell, the arts are one, martial or otherwise. If my opponent would consent, I would like my band to play during our match." Edge was nodding. They squared up.
"Begin!"
Jacob immediately realized Edward was holding his spear around the center, where Edge was holding it at the end. This was to be a battle of thrusting, it appeared to the common eye. "No. This is a battle of land control. They are both too good to get hit. They will try to force the other out of the ring. Their thrust will be to get their opponent to move," not to hit them. The guitarists were strumming. Edge began with a flurry of thrusts. His shaft must have been made of a special kind of wood, because it was wobbling back and forth, jiggling all around. Edward used his superior control over his whole weapon to get the shaft out of the way, edging ever closer to Edge with each parry. A poke sent Edge jumping back. He began circling his opponent, moving closer to the center. Edward spun his spear so quickly the tassel looked as though it were creating a solid circle. Any attack Edge made was sent back the way it came, so he began swinging as if it had a cutting edge. Smart. He doesn't need to worry about edge alignment in a tournament like this. One good hit and it will be over. But the Northern Prince was too quick, and he blocked every one. Edge stepped back and grabbed his spear as far back as he could, and brought it over his head, swinging it down at the prince. It looked absurd, and the prince easily blocked it, but the wobbly haft curved around the prince's block and came down right on his skull. The winner was Edge. That was a risky move. If the prince had decided to parry instead of block, it would have gone the other way. Edward held his head for a brief moment, and went to his opponent and embraced him before kissing him on the mouth. Sir Frederick returned at the wrong time. "What the hell is going on down there?" "Excuse my language, Your Majesty." His Majesty sat speechless. Edge didn't look like he knew what to do after that, so he left, wiping his mouth. Meanwhile, Prince Edward took a lute and began strumming away, and the crowd was cheering for the loser. Steve Williams was unaffiliated, and a commoner most likely, so he had no music. Prince Edward fixed that. The song he played was violent and harsh, and Steve came out with a tankard of ale which he poured right down his throat once he entered the ring. The crowd cheered. Ronald Rovskar got cheers and booze. In order to assure favor with the crowd, Ronald took the horn. "Now, Steve, I know you got lucky against my brother Roger. You're a pugilist. You use your fists, and I understand that. But I'm about to use cold steel to show you my wyvern pride." Steve Williams was clad in a mail hauberk and some plate greaves. He walked over to his opponent and grabbed the horn. "You ever say anything like that to me again, I'll stick this horn straight up your ass." The crowd cheered. "Now we're both good competitors. Can you agree with that? I don't care if you agree. Before we get started, we're going to get something straight right off the bat. I'm going to kick your ass. Now what do you think?" he asked the crowd. "If I'm going to beat this son of a bitch's ass, give me a hell yeah." The crowd gave a raucous, "Hell yeah!" Even the wyverns. Lady Alice even joined on her horn. "If I'm going to be the champion today, give me a hell yeah." "Hell yeah!" "If I'm going to spend every last bit of that gold on ale and beer, give me a hell yeah." "Hell yeah!" "If I'm going to get so drunk I won't even remember this tournament, give me a hell yeah." "Hell yeah!" "If I'm going to start my own faction called the Ass Kickers, give me a hell yeah." "Hell yeah!" "Start the f***ing match," he said, as he pushed the horn at the proctor. And he pushed the horn at the proctor. The crowd gave their loudest cheer they had all day. The king was annoyed. Are they ever going to fight? I didn't come to watch men shout at each other all day. This is part of the strategy. He's winning favor with the crowd, and that will set his opponent on edge, fracturing his focus. Ronald Rovskar lunged at his opponent. And so it starts. Steve Williams bopped him in the face. Ronald Rovskar was dazed, and Steve threw the sword from his hand. He kicked the stunned Rovskar, and again, with the same exact kick. It wasn't even a very good kick. "What farce is this? Why is he letting himself get hit?" complained the king. Sir Frederick responded, "Because he can't, Your Majesty. His body won't listen to him, and he can't think. Steve Williams has gotten thoroughly into his opponent's head, and it is beautiful. Not all strength can be measured with power and speed, it seems." Jacob turned to him. "Wow, that's a really good way of putting it." Meanwhile, Ronald Rovskar was on the ground being stomped. The crowd was cheering wildly. Steve Williams took the horn. "You suck," he said, to cheers. "What do you think? Does he suck?" The crowd erupted into chant, "Rovskar sucks! Rovskar sucks!" Ronald Rovskar got to his feet, and he swung wildly at his opponent. Steve kicked him in his armored abdomen, which bent him over for some reason. He shouldn't have been able to feel it through his armor. Steve grabbed him by the neck and threw him out of the ring. The crowd roared. Ronald Rovskar had been beaten without even taking any damage. In the next round, the hooligan, Lauren Fossa, completely dismantled the griffin named Hum, jabbing at all of the gaps in his armor. The match lasted less than a minute. "If I'm right, we have another intra-faction match next," complained the king. "Right you are, your majesty," said Sir Simon. "Two wyverns. Mark Isaac versus Randall Cloud." Mark Isaac was a wyvern with spiked hair and a giant sword. Randall Cloud was a wyvern with even spikier hair and an even bigger sword. Though his sword was easily twice the size of Mark's, he swung it faster and moved more quickly than anyone would think for a man his size. He was a less than average height, and the sword he had was about as thick and tall as he was. His opponent was bigger than him, and looked much stronger, but he appeared to struggle more with his much smaller sword, as massive as it was. "I remember Mark Isaac," said the king. "He competed last year, and the year before that. He appears to have doubled in volume. Last year he could barely swing that big hunk of steel. He had gotten stronger and faster from what Jacob could tell, but he was being completely decimated by his opponent." "I don't ever remember this Randall, though. The name Cloud is interesting. Isn't that the name they give bastards in Adavi?" The king leaned forward in his seat, stroking his beard. "Yes, indeed, your majesty," Sir Simon interjected. "The wizards adopt orphans and raise them learning a certain skill or trade, making master artisans. And in this case, it seems, a skilled warrior." The king shook his head. "That's no good. A man shouldn't be that strong. I shudder to think what they did to him to make him like that." The match went as one would expect. Randall was stronger, faster, more skilled, and smarter than his opponent. Randall was the winner. "By the way, your majesty, the score sits at 3 wyverns, 2 griffins, and 3 unaffiliated," Sir Simon said, proudly. "And the 2 griffins are Sock and Lu Bu. Great." The king did not sound happy. Welcome to the Storytime Saturday podcast. I'm your host, TGD. This week we go back to the tournament that's happening. The Kingsguard Sir Jacob is in the king's box with the king, watching the tournament unfold. So, as usual, we'll start our analysis of this chapter with the writing aspect of it. And a lot of this is very bland narration. Simply a this happened, that happened type stuff. This happened, that happened. Cause, effect. Like just right here. Sir Frederick jabbed at him and Z ducked beneath the blade, falling to the ground and swiped at his knee. Sir Frederick blocked and went for a lunging jab, and Z knocked his blade skyward. His blade swung over his head and he brought it back down to block a kick that Z aimed at him. Sir Frederick swung lightning quick at Z, who rolled out of the way, returning to his feet. Sir Frederick launched a frenzy of blows at opponent. Not like it's really bland. There's not really any poetry. Like, saying someone was lightning quick is the most poetic it gets. So, I wanted it to be fast-paced, so that you're reading this and, like, getting invested, saying, yes, and then that happened. Like, you're excited to watch the action unfold. But it kind of just ends up being tedious to read. It doesn't really paint the picture in your head like I wanted. Because this, especially this Sir Frederick and Z fight, is really cool. And the Edge and Edward Guevara fight is cool as well. But you can't really tell. Because it's not written too exciting. Now really the most that's done for poetry is that Z and Frederick, their blades sent a song through the arena. And that is like the most cookie cutter, like by the book way of describing swords clanging. So writing wise, like the art, writing art wise, it's not very thrilling. Although I like the stuff that happens. I think the stuff that happens is cool. So let's go over the characters. Sir Jacob is the point of view character for this chapter, so let's talk about him a little bit. We see him marveling at Z's different styles, and we see some more of his fight IQ. So where the king sees an even match, Sir Jacob sees that Sir Frederick is losing. Like, he can actually see what's going on. So the king is really just a layman. We'll talk more about him. We'll talk about him a little bit later. But Sir Jacob really is the expert analysis here. He sees what's actually going on. He sees beyond what the layman can see. It's like I mentioned in the last chapter when I was watching a knockout compilation with Jordan, who's another character in this book. He was the one guy just took a stance, and Jordan goes, he's squaring up for a kick. And then the guy kicks him right in the head, knocks him right out. I was amazed. So that's my experience with fight IQ, and that's what Sir Jacob has in droves. Now, interestingly enough, we see Sir Jacob regret not entering this year as he's watching Z's match. He's watching Z take on all these different stances. He's like, oh, that's actually interesting. I wish I entered. And it's kind of funny that after the match, he interrupts Sir Frederick from getting water. He says, why have you been holding back on me this whole time? Well, I didn't know you knew all those styles. And Sir Frederick's like, what do you mean? I use all those styles all the time. So that kind of hints to us that maybe Sir Jacob can't even remember his fights. Perhaps that's indicating that he just kind of shuts his brain off and he just fights intuitively. He uses intuition. Now let's talk about a few of the competitors. Let's talk about Sock. Sock is a heel. Sock is playing the heel here. He's a good heel. Now, if you don't remember from the last tournament chapter with Sir Jacob, Sock is just copy and paste Scott Steiner. Look up Scott Steiner, and this is what this guy looks and sounds like. So, let me explain a heel. You might know about this already, but I'll explain it quick. So in wrestling, the heel's job is to make you cheer for the good guy. The heel's job is to be the most annoying, despicable, or frightening guy that you want his butt to get kicked. You want this guy to lose because you hate him so much. And that's what Sock is doing here. And we see it working on the king. The king's like, what? Can't they just fight? I hope Vald knocks him out. So he's cursing, and when the ref stops the match, he starts throttling him and demanding it to be restarted. So according to the rules of the tournament, Sock lost, but he won by being despicable and intimidating the official. I might not have read it right, but I spell exceptional Excepshinal. Exceptional. Because that's kind of how Scott Steiner talks. So let's talk about Z a little bit. We see a little bit more of Z in this chapter. We see him show some respect to Sir Frederick by addressing him in front of the crowd, by taking a horn and addressing him in front of the crowd. Z knows he's going against a skilled opponent, so he decides to really test how skilled he is by trying different styles on him and seeing how he reacts. So Z's really just playing around. He's testing Sir Frederick here to see how good he actually is and how he responds to these different styles. So he goes from like an Italian longsword to a drunken fist style to fencing, and then he just lets it rip. We see him conversing with Sir Frederick throughout the match. It'll say, Z said something and nodded his head, and Sir Frederick agreed and nodded his head. So they were interacting. They were talking the entire time, but back in the King's box, we're too far away to hear. But this mysterious Traveler Z ends up getting the best of Sir Frederick Thorncrest of the King's Guard. Now let's talk about Sir Frederick for a minute. So as soon as Jacob sees Sir Frederick is losing, we go, okay, here we go. I see what's going on. Sir Frederick is just being fed to Z to put him over. We know that Sir Frederick is in the Kingsguard and he's good, and now we're just going to feed him to Z so that we show that Z is actually the strongest fighter. Like, you're supposed to be like, okay, I get what's going on here. But then Sir Frederick starts changing styles as well. So we see that he's not really just an average man-at-arms. He's not just a cardboard cutout that's strong for Z to just devour to prove how strong he is. We show that he's actually a competent knight of the Kingsguard entrusted with the protection of the king. He's no slouch. And he removes his armor and he's jacked. So we have a dreamy gentleman in Sir Frederick. But there's this show called, or this manga called Baki, where every single world-class athlete, like they'll bring up, this is the boxing champion of the world, the lineal champion, and then they'll just have one of the main characters just punch him in the face and knock him out in one hit and completely humiliate him to show that world-class athletes are nothing compared to our main characters. That's not, I don't like that. That's not very good. So I like that Sir Frederick gets some respect and that it's kind of even. We get the indication that Z is actually trying against Sir Frederick. So last we have the king, and we see the king really has an everyman view, as I've mentioned before. The king sort of has an everyman view. It's how a layman would be viewing what's happening. And he's just complaining the entire time. I want to point out at the very end of the chapter that, if you remember, the king has to hold audience with whoever wins the tournament. And he's upset that the two griffins that are left are Sock and Lu Bu, since they're so dominant, and he does not want the griffins to win, because the griffins are like this they're not explicitly anti-monarchy, but they have anti-monarchy tones. So they don't directly oppose the king, but they also kind of do. So let's take some notes here. It's mentioned in the beginning that the sun is beating down on the ring, and nobody uses that in a clever way. It doesn't mean anything. It's not foreshadowing or anything. It's just setting the scene, letting you know that it's about noon. That's about it. So Edward Guevara, he's from the north. You remember in the very beginning, in Geoffrey's first chapter, in the very start of the book, the king puts someone to death from the north for being caught in another man's bed. And Edward Guevara is from the north, and after he loses to Edge, he brings him in and gives him a big smooch on the mouth. We get to the north later. Gerald eventually gets to the north. But we can kind of see from Edward Guevara what the north is like. He's like your average Northman. But we'll talk more about the north when we get to it. Now, Edge, his opponent, is entirely based on the WWE wrestler Edge. And Edge in this book wields a spear, and Edge the wrestler, his finishing move is called the spear. So, big brain, massive brain. Speaking of weapons, the swords and spears, everything is blunted. That's mentioned earlier in the book. And we see weird stuff like Edward Guevara's custom spear with the crisp blade, Z's sword, Sir Frederick's sword. We get the indication that those are their actual weapons, that they're real weapons. So it kind of brings up the question, were they blunted for the tournament? Probably not. But it definitely doesn't seem like Warren's place, that the tournament is providing the blunted equipment. Like, we have that moment where they're both admiring. Z takes Sir Frederick's sword, and Sir Frederick takes Z's sword, and they're both admiring the craftsmanship. So you're like, so those are the real? Are they the real swords? What's going on here? So, not a whole lot of thought put into that. Honestly, it's kind of weird. And you should kind of be able to tell. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the characters, some of the miscellaneous fighters like Steve Williams. Steve Williams is literally just Stone Cold Steve Austin. We see that here. And I wanted to really pay homage to Stone Cold as the greatest babyface of all time, where crowds are absolutely head over heels for him. The crowd is completely invested in Steve Williams, and they're chanting and doing everything he says, and I like that he gets into his opponent's head. That his charisma is so high that it messes with his opponent's head, and he can't even fight back. So that's kind of funny. Now, Randall Cloud, I want to talk about him for just a minute. I know this episode is a little bit longer than usual. We'll go a little bit longer. Randall Cloud is literally just Cloud from Final Fantasy. He has spiky hair and a big sword. And his name is Randall because in the Yoshi's Story stage in Smash Bros. Melee, the cloud that goes around the map, his name is Randall. So, Randall Cloud. And there's a bit of a Game of Thrones thing with his name being Cloud. Like, the children in Westeros have Snow, like Jon Snow is an illegitimate child from the north, and Sand is the illegitimate children from Dorne, and Stone is the illegitimate children from I don't know, the Vale. I don't know. I don't remember. So that the illegitimate children have a special last name, and Cloud is the special name from Adavi, where he's from, which is also where the Wizard College is. And Randall is unnaturally strong, and the king sort of surmises, I shudder what they did to him to make him like that. So, they're performing some experiments on Randall. On top of that, Mark Isaac, I think, is literally just Ike from Fire Emblem. He also has a big sword, but it's not as big as a Buster sword, and he moves it slower. So, that's the end of that chapter. That's really all I have to say about that. So, thanks for joining me for this week. Now, next week, we go back to Lark's Vale, back to Brandon to see what's up with him. This is the first point of view chapter we get from Brandon since the attack. So we'll get to see how that's affecting him. We remember Josh is stormed out of the room, so we'll see what's going on with Brandon in Lark's Vale next week. But until then, make sure you like the video. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and like wherever else you may be listening to this. Now, I thank you for joining me on the Storytime Saturday podcast. It's always fun, and I'm glad you're here. Thanks for joining.